Beneath the towering hedges of Foxley Hall stood iron gates polished until they gleamed, the kind of gates that suggested safety and refinement, the kind of gates a passing villager might look upon and whisper that the Foxleys were chosen by God to prosper. To the eye of the outside world, Lord Edmund Foxley and his wife Lady Catherine appeared as perfect subjects of Queen Anne, their family admired for loyalty, charity, and devotion. Parish records glowed with Foxley donations. Servants were seen kneeling beside them in Sunday pews, and visiting nobles were welcomed into manicured gardens where nothing seemed out of place. But what appeared as noble guardianship was, inside those walls, something very different. The iron that guarded their gates was the same iron that began to shape their children's lives, first as a symbol of control, then as a tool of torment. Edmund Foxley had studied the writings of royal physicians who claimed the body must be tamed if the soul was to be saved. He twisted their words into a doctrine of protection, convincing himself that restraint was the only path to virtue. In the nursery of Foxley Hall, the children were not laid to rest in cradles but strapped into contraptions of Edmund's own design, wooden frames bound with belts that held arms and legs rigid so that not even a twitch went unnoticed. To servants, he explained, this prevented wayward limbs from causing harm, that it saved infants from the dangers of sudden night fits. But the children's muffled cries told another story, their little bodies swelling against straps that cut deeper each night. Death first visited the family in silence when Edmund's nephew, left in one of these so-called protective frames, slipped into stillness before dawn. The child's face had pressed against a leather muzzle sewn to keep his mouth closed during sleep, and when morning came, there was no breath left inside him. To the outside world, the boy was said to have died of weakness, a frailty common in youth, and neighbors sent prayers rather than questions. For Edmund, the death was not tragedy but confirmation. In his mind, God had revealed who among the young was strong enough to survive the discipline of restraint and who was not. His hand grew steadier as he adjusted the straps the following night, writing neat notes in a ledger he titled Custodia, the Book of Keeping. Each line recorded how long a child lasted before fainting, how many hours their heartbeat fought against confinement, how silence fell when the body finally gave up. These were not random cruelties, but steps in a methodical design, experiments masked as protection, each body reduced to evidence in a ritual that no outsider could ever name. To servants who dared whisper, he spoke softly of sin and salvation, telling them that suffering was necessary to shield the innocent from darker fates. Those who resisted either fled or fell silent, for the Foxley estate had a way of swallowing questions whole. Even Lady Catherine, who smiled with grace at Queen Anne's court, played her part with quiet obedience, presenting herself as the model of a pious wife while her children bore the cost. She arranged the nursery each evening, polishing the locks that held the frames together, humming hymns that disguised the whimpers behind the door. To guests, she described her methods as maternal caution, claiming it kept her little ones from wandering at night or tumbling down staircases. Many praised her care, mistaking cruelty for foresight, never daring to imagine what really happened when the doors were closed and the lamps extinguished. By the turn of the century, whispers had already begun in nearby villages. Why did the Foxley children so rarely appear in public? Why did their faces look so pale when glimpsed at the windows? Yet suspicion never bloomed into action, for the Foxleys were noble, and nobility cloaked sins with the illusion of wisdom. No villager wished to be the first to accuse, and no priest wished to challenge a patron of the church. Thus, the deaths remained hidden in plain sight, each explained away, each sealed behind the iron gates of normalcy. And as Edmund Foxley refined his methods, the cages that began as crude frames would evolve into something far more permanent. Something that would not only bind the body, but bind the soul itself. Lord Edmund Foxley carried himself with the calm authority of a man who believed he was chosen to refine the very laws of nature. To outsiders, he was a noble touched by modern thinking, a patron of physicians, a man who read the newest treatises on medicine and the body. He often cited royal physicians who declared that children were prone to weakness and that discipline of the flesh could strengthen the soul. But where others saw theory, Foxley saw instruction, and within the walls of his mansion he transformed his household into a private laboratory where doctrine and cruelty were indistinguishable. The doctrine he named protection. He told his wife, his servants, and even visiting clergymen that every measure he took was for the good of the children, to shield them from the dangers of the world. Yet the cages he designed were not shields, they were prisons. In the nursery, rows of iron frames hung from the ceiling like lanterns. Into each frame a child was placed at night, their small bodies confined in iron lattice work with bars so close together their limbs could hardly move. Foxley insisted this prevented them from thrashing in their sleep, protected them from falls, and kept them safe from vermin that might crawl into their bedding. But the reality was harsher. The cages swayed like pendulums when the children shifted, chains creaking in the dark. The air inside was cold and heavy, and every breath echoed against metal. They were not permitted to lie on soft cloth. Instead, beneath them, spiked ridges pressed into their skin, shallow enough not to kill, but sharp enough to forbid rest. Beyond dawn, their young bodies were covered in bruises, some bleeding where they had pressed too hard against the steel. Edmund recorded each mark carefully, treating suffering as evidence of progress. The first child to die within this new order was his youngest daughter, Clara. Only 5 years old, she had tried to wedge her arm through the bars in desperate search for comfort, only to twist her shoulder until it broke. The bone tore through skin and infection followed. Foxley did not call for physicians, claiming instead that her death proved her unfit to survive the discipline required of a Foxley child. Clara was buried without a marker, and her cage was polished and reused by another sibling the following week. To Edmund, loss was not tragedy but purification, and he explained her death as a necessary offering to the perfection of the family line. In his mind, children who perished were not victims but sacrifices to the doctrine of protection. The psychological toll spread quietly. The surviving children stopped speaking freely. Their voices shrank into whispers, their eyes dulled by exhaustion. They no longer cried at night, for crying only meant longer hours suspended in those cages. They learned stillness as a form of survival, holding their breath until their ribs ached, moving no more than a finger to keep from stirring the chains. Yet their stillness was not peace, it was terror in disguise, and Edmund mistook it as obedience. He spoke often of how his methods proved successful, pointing to the silence of his halls as evidence that discipline worked. But that silence was not loyalty. It was the sound of childhood eroded into submission, a sound he mistook as divine approval. Servants who dared question were shown demonstrations. Edmund would invite them to watch as he placed a child into the cage, carefully adjusting straps and tightening locks with a surgeon's precision. He explained how the bars protected the child's fragile bones, how the spikes trained the body to resist laziness, how the swaying chains soothed the spirit like a cradle. He did not see pain. He saw design. Those who doubted quickly learned that dissent was dangerous. One maid who cried at the sight of Clara's failing body was accused of corrupting the girl with weakness. Days later, she disappeared, her name scratched from the servant rolls. Some whispered that her screams had been heard faintly in the cellars, cut short by the turning of locks. Every detail of Foxley's cruelty was wrapped in the language of care. He wrote to friends about his methods, boasting that he had created an environment where children could not fall into sin. He claimed the cages shielded them from temptation, from wandering the halls at night, from whispering to one another in secrecy. In truth, the cages ensured that every child suffered alone, their bodies held in unrelenting embrace by cold iron. Each sunrise was not a relief, but another sentence served, another chance for Foxley to refine his experiment. The neighbors who visited never suspected. They saw the children brought out during the day, pale but neatly dressed, their silence mistaken for manners. They admired the Foxley household as orderly, clean, and devout. None could imagine that those same children had spent the night suspended in darkness, whispering prayers not for salvation but for release from their father's love. In this way, the cages did not only shape bodies, they shaped souls, bending them into quiet survivors of his doctrine. But for Edmund Foxley, this was only the beginning. The cages were his foundation, and soon he would seek greater ways to enforce silence, to carve obedience not just into flesh, but into the very spirit of his children. The cages became the very definition of childhood inside Foxley Hall. They swung from the ceilings like lanterns in a dungeon, each iron frame rocking with a rhythm that was meant to lull but instead instilled dread. Edmund Foxley called them cradles, his invention to protect the young from danger. But the truth was written across the children's bruised bodies. Every bar was cold to the touch. Every chain groaned when shifted, and every surface carried the memory of suffering. The cages lined the nursery in neat rows, swaying together in the dark as though the children were nothing more than weights hung to test gravity. For Edmund, it was the perfection of order. For the children, it was the nightly promise of pain. The cages were not meant only to restrain. Their design included outward-facing spikes that punished any attempt at escape. Should a desperate hand reach through, the flesh would be cut open and blood would stain the iron until Edmund ordered the cages polished again. He insisted the spikes were never intended as cruelty, only as protection, claiming that accidents would be avoided if no child could reach too far. The lie was so well rehearsed that even visiting nobles repeated his words with admiration, marveling at the discipline of children who slept suspended without stirring. Yet when dawn came, the bruises were deep, the cuts were fresh, and silence clung to the hall like a disease. The cages were a ritual, each night a ceremony of suffering designed to remind every child that their father's will was absolute. The children's minds began to fracture under the weight of such ritual. Sleep became an enemy. a state where their bodies twitched against the spikes or the rocking chains jolted them awake. Dreams were filled with falling endlessly, with bars closing tighter, with the knowledge that even their unconscious selves were not safe from their father's doctrine. Some children prayed until their lips bled, whispering pleas into the iron that muffled their voices until they dissolved into sobs. Others learned to stop feeling, to let their bodies hang limply so the rocking would be gentle and the spikes would not bite as hard. Stillness became survival, and in that stillness, their childhoods withered. The first to be lost was Samuel, the eldest son. He had grown strong enough to resent the cages, strong enough to test their limits. One night, he pulled so fiercely at the bars that the entire frame shook and the chains holding it snapped. The cage fell from its hook, crashing onto the floor with a sound that rattled the hall. For a moment, the boy tasted freedom crawling out through the shattered frame, but Edmund was waiting. To him, Samuel's rebellion was not bravery but sin. The punishment was methodical. Samuel was locked into a new cage, one specially made with bars pressed so tightly together that his chest could barely rise and fall. He was left suspended for 3 days without food or water, his body shrinking inside its iron prison until his voice faded into silence. When the cage was finally lowered, the boy inside was already gone. His siblings watched from their own cages as servants carried the body away. They learned then that even death would not break the ritual, for by the next night the nursery was filled again with the sound of chains rocking gently in unison. Edmund recorded Samuel's failure in his ledger without remorse, describing it as proof that rebellion was weakness unfit for the Foxley bloodline. He called his son's death a lesson to the others, a necessary sacrifice to ensure obedience. He even used the tragedy to boast before visiting nobles, claiming his methods produced children so disciplined that even the weakest link could not disrupt the household's harmony. To his guests, it was a curious philosophy, eccentric but admirable in its severity. To the children, it was the moment they realized their father was not a guardian but a predator, feeding on their fear, reshaping their lives into a pattern of torment that no prayer could undo. The psychological toll deepened with each passing year. The children no longer wept when placed in their cages. Tears had no purpose when no one came to comfort them. They began to treat the cages as their only homes, their small bodies curling into shapes that fit the bars, their backs bearing permanent ridges from the spikes that pressed against them night after night. Some even refused to leave the cages in daylight, convinced that the outside world was more dangerous than the prison they knew. Edmund saw this as victory, the proof that his doctrine of protection was working. But the victory was hollow, for he was breeding not loyalty but brokenness, hollowing out the very souls he claimed to shield. When nobles toured the nursery, they saw children lying still in their suspended frames, pale and silent, and praised Edmund's genius. They believed his words when he claimed the cages prevented falls, kept the children from crawling into danger, or spared them from the illnesses of the floor. They never asked why the children did not smile, why their eyes followed every movement with fear instead of trust. No one wanted to believe that suffering could hide so neatly behind the mask of parental care. The cages stood as monuments to a twisted vision, Rows of swaying prisons disguised as cradles, each one rocking like a pendulum marking time. And with every swing, Edmund Foxley's conviction grew sharper, his belief more unshakable. He had convinced himself that he was not tormenting his children but refining them, purging weakness from their blood, preparing them for a world he alone understood. Yet the truth lingered in the bruises, in the silenced cries, in the graves dug for those who did not survive his design. The cages were only the beginning, and in Foxley's mind, greater refinements awaited. The next step would be not only to restrain the body, but to silence the voice itself, ensuring that obedience was not simply lived, but spoken in whispers, or not spoken at all. The silence of Foxley Hall was never natural. It was not the calm stillness of peace, but the hollow quiet of fear pressed into young lungs until sound itself became dangerous. For Edmund Foxley, noise was not a nuisance but a threat to his order, a sign that discipline had failed. He told his family and servants that every word unmeasured, every cry uncontained was an opening for sin to enter. And so he built a system where silence itself became ritual, a form of worship he demanded from his children as if it were an offering to God. The cages had already bent their small bodies, but Foxley was not satisfied with obedience of posture alone. He wanted obedience of the tongue, a shaping of speech so strict that even breath carried weight. To achieve this, he crafted muzzles of iron lined with small, inward-facing spikes sharpened to needles. Each mask was fitted over the child's mouth and tightened behind the skull until the jaw ached. If the child cried, the tongue pressed against the metal thorns and tore itself apart. If they screamed, their mouths filled with blood. To Edmund, the pain was not cruelty but correction, proof that words must be measured as carefully as prayers. He told himself the muzzles were guardians of purity, barriers against wicked chatter, instruments that taught restraint better than sermons ever could. The first child to wear the device was Margaret, a girl of 7 who sobbed uncontrollably after watching her brother collapse in his cage. Edmund locked the iron over her face and ordered the servants to lift her back into suspension. For hours, her cries were muffled into wet gurgles until they broke into silence. By morning, blood streaked the muzzle and her tongue hung swollen, nearly useless. She never spoke again, not because her father demanded it, but because her body would not allow her. Edmund recorded this as success, a note of triumph in his ledger. He wrote that Margaret had been purified by silence, her weakness cut from her like a diseased limb. But the muzzles were only one step. For children who resisted, who dared to wail despite the threat of torn tongues, Edmund devised another ritual. He ordered servants to drag them from their cages into stone chambers where basins of icy water had been prepared. There the children were stripped and lowered into freezing baths, their thin frames trembling violently as the cold consumed them. If they cried louder, they were held beneath the surface, their small bodies thrashing until bubbles rose and the sound of panic drowned in the water. Only when they fell limp were they lifted again, gasping, coughing, their eyes wide with terror. This was repeated again and again until silence became instinct, until the mere thought of a sound carried the memory of drowning. One by one, the children adapted, but adaptation came at terrible cost. Some became shadows, their eyes unfocused, their tongues mangled, and their bodies permanently shivering from the cold. Others simply broke, Edmund's son Henry did not survive his third trial, his lungs filling with icy water until his body gave out. When they dragged him from the basin, his lips were blue, his fingers stiff, his chest unmoving. Edmund called the death a failure of the boy's spirit, declaring before his family that God had chosen to take him rather than allow him to live without discipline. The servants buried him quickly in the earth behind the chapel, but his siblings were forced to attend, their faces pressed down toward the frozen body as their father lectured that this was the price of disobedience. Death was not an accident in Foxley Hall. It was a consequence deliberately built into the doctrine. The psychological toll on the children was devastating. Words became dangerous objects, weapons that could harm their own flesh. They learned to whisper prayers into the iron bars so softly that even God seemed unlikely to hear them. Their dreams were haunted by water, by the weight of iron on their tongues, by the sensation of drowning in their father's faith. Sleep became no refuge, for in dreams they spoke freely and awoke to the terror that they might have spoken too loudly in truth. Silence was no longer obedience, it was survival. Edmund believed he was teaching loyalty not only to himself but to heaven itself. He convinced himself that these rituals were not torture but sacred tests, each moment of pain refining the child's soul into purity. He spoke of his methods as if they were scripture, telling servants that his children were blessed to be chosen for discipline. He imagined himself as a priest of silence, his hall a monastery where the holy language was quiet, and where death itself was a kind of salvation. But beneath this self-made holiness lay only bloodied tongues, lifeless bodies, and the broken voices of children who would never speak again. The muzzles hung on the walls like relics when not in use, glinting in the dim candlelight of the nursery. Each carried the stains of past suffering, each a reminder of what would come if sound dared to break the quiet. The servants avoided looking at them, for to see them was to know what had been done. But Edmund looked proudly, polishing them as if they were trophies, convinced that silence had finally been mastered within his domain. And yet, for all his satisfaction, Foxley's hunger for control was far from sated. He had bound their bodies and silenced their tongues, but his mind whispered that there were still greater tests to come. He would not be content until loyalty was absolute, until even the weak were reshaped by ritual. The doctrine of silence was only one chapter in his design. Soon the doctrine of sacrifice would follow. The silence that Edmund Foxley had cultivated within his children was not enough to satisfy the depths of his doctrine. In his mind, the proof of truth could not remain confined to the weak and voiceless in his own household. It had to be tested, displayed, and refined before the eyes of those he believed would understand. Men of learning, physicians of standing, nobles of minor rank who would recognize his brilliance. And so Foxley opened the gates of his hall to guests, welcoming them with a charm that seemed effortless. They entered through polished corridors, dined on rich meals, and listened to Edmund speak with eloquence about philosophy, medicine, and the sacred duty of discipline. To those who arrived, Foxley Hall seemed a sanctuary of intellect and faith. But in truth, it was a carefully designed trap. For once the gates closed, few would ever leave again. Foxley had prepared chambers deep beneath the estate, hidden by bricked passages and shifting walls that only he and his most trusted servants knew. These rooms were never shown to visitors on their first nights. They were revealed only after Foxley had measured their curiosity, weighed their skepticism, and decided whether they were worthy of his experiments. A scholar who questioned his doctrines too loudly would be escorted below on the pretext of being shown rare manuscripts or instruments of learning. Once inside, the door would be sealed, and what began as hospitality turned into imprisonment. In these underground chambers, Foxley perfected methods of slow death that were both scientific and symbolic, designed not only to end lives but to erase hope. One chamber was built as a banquet that could never be eaten. In the center stood a long wooden table covered with platters of food preserved under glass, roasted meats, fruits gleaming with sugar, loaves of bread baked to golden perfection. Around the table ran a narrow pit too wide to cross, leaving the prisoner locked in a ring of stone, able to see and smell the feast but never touch it. At first, hunger gnawed slowly. The body tightened, the stomach clawed at itself, and the prisoner paced the stone ring until exhaustion took hold. Days later, madness set in, the vision of food becoming a torment sharper than chains. Foxley watched from hidden grates above, taking notes as bodies thinned, as hands clawed against the stone walls, as once learned men dropped to their knees begging for crumbs that never came. The deaths were not quick, and the silence that followed each one was a silence Foxley treasured as much as any hymn. Another chamber was lined from floor to ceiling with mirrors, a circular prison where every movement was multiplied into endless reflections. The prisoner who entered at first stared at his own image with unease, but unease soon gave way to collapse. Days spent under the light of lanterns with no corner to hide in, no shadow to rest the eyes, turned even the most rational minds into splintered glass. In those mirrored walls, prisoners saw their bodies decay. Their faces sag into hollowness. Their eyes become unrecognizable. Some screamed until their voices cracked. Others clawed at their own skin, convinced that the reflections were mockeries come to consume them. When death finally arrived, whether by starvation, exhaustion, or self-destruction, the body was left surrounded by 1,000 images of its own ruin. Foxley called these chambers lessons of truth, for he believed the mirrors revealed the soul's inability to withstand the burden of its own reflection. Each death was methodical, each body another entry in his ledger. Foxley noted not only the time it took for the body to collapse, but the stages of the mind's surrender, the ways hunger or isolation bent even the strongest into compliance. He saw himself as a scientist of despair, a man chosen to expose how thin the line was between human dignity and animal submission. To Edmund, their deaths were not murders, but offerings to knowledge, proof that his doctrine reached beyond children into the realm of the learned and the noble. He imagined one day presenting his findings at court, speaking before the queen herself, showing how discipline could shape not only a household but a nation. The servants knew better. They carried scraps of food to the halls above, their hands trembling as they heard muffled cries through the stone. They avoided the passages beneath the estate, for the walls seemed to hum with suffering, with voices begging not for freedom but for release from the endless rituals below. Some swore they heard prayers echoing through the floors at night, prayers so desperate they sounded less human than animal. Yet none spoke openly, for to question was to risk becoming part of the ledger themselves. The toll on Foxley's own mind was both subtle and profound. Each experiment seemed to carve away what little remained of his empathy, leaving him colder, more convinced of his divine mission. He no longer flinched at the sight of death, but treated it as punctuation, the natural conclusion to a test well run. He began to see himself less as a father or a lord and more as a priest of suffering. His house a cathedral where pain was the liturgy and silence the final sacrament. And yet he never abandoned the mask of innocence. At dinners with nobles he laughed, softly, raising cups of wine and speaking of devotion to crown and church. To visitors who did leave, he was remembered as eccentric but harmless, a man of odd ideas but generous heart. Only the vanished knew the truth, and they had no voices left to tell it. Beneath the earth, the bricked rooms filled with bodies. Some were sealed in darkness, left to rot without witness. Others remained in their mirrored prisons, skeletal faces forever reflected in shattered glass. When investigators would uncover them decades later, the horror would be almost unspeakable. But in Edmund's time, the chambers remained secret, his doctrine unchallenged, his experiments expanding with each passing season. For in his mind, the suffering of outsiders was only proof that his methods worked, and he began to dream of rituals far darker than confinement or hunger. Rituals that would demand not only silence, but sacrifice. When famine spread across the countryside, gnawing at every household with hunger, Edmund Foxley saw not despair but opportunity. Where others feared scarcity, he imagined a new order, one that would elevate his doctrine of discipline into the realm of sacrifice. In the parish, priests preached that suffering was a test sent by God, a trial to separate the faithful from the faithless. Edmund twisted those words into something far darker, convincing himself that the famine was not a punishment but a summons, a chance to refine the weak from the strong. In his ledger, he wrote that food was not the true currency of survival. The true exchange was blood, and the offering of children would be the tithe demanded by heaven. He designed the instrument of this ritual with the same precision he had given to the cages and muzzles before. It was shaped like a womb, built of iron and curved to hold the curled body of a child within. At first glance, it resembled a protective cradle, but beneath its surface lay hidden trays that could be stoked with burning coals. When the iron grew hot, the womb became both tomb and altar, a place where flesh blistered and voices broke in agony. Foxley claimed that God demanded the weakest be given back in exchange for the survival of the whole. He told grieving parents that to resist was to deny heaven's will, and many, desperate and broken by hunger, bowed to his authority. The first to be sacrificed was a frail boy named Thomas, the son of one of Foxley's tenants. His body had grown thin with famine, his eyes too heavy to keep open. Edmund declared him chosen, marked by weakness to be exchanged for the strength of others. The boy was placed inside the iron womb while the congregation was gathered above in the chapel. To hide the screams, Edmund ordered hymns to be sung louder and louder, their voices rising in trembling devotion as smoke began to rise between the floorboards. The mother collapsed into the arms of neighbors, her grief drowned by the chanting that claimed holiness was being fulfilled. When the hymns finally ended, Thomas was gone, his body reduced to silence, his suffering repackaged as sacrifice. Edmund marked the moment in his ledger as the first offering, writing that the purity of the ritual would shield the community from famine. In the weeks that followed, more children were taken, always the weakest, always explained as necessary to spare the others. Families were told that grief was proof of their loyalty, that the death of one would bless the survival of many. Parents who resisted were reminded of the fate of their neighbors, told that to refuse would be to condemn their entire household to God's wrath. The Iron Womb became the unspoken center of Foxley Hall, an altar that bound the village in terror and silence. The rituals repeated, hymns rising, flames burning, until death itself became ordinary. Each child lost was recorded in Edmund's careful hand, their names etched into the ledger as though they were entries in a holy scripture. The children who remained alive learned to live under the shadow of this order. At night they stared at the Iron Womb, terrified it would one day be opened for them. They became obsessed with strength, forcing their thin bodies to stand straight, swallowing food even when their stomachs rebelled, doing anything to avoid being marked as weak. Childhood became nothing more than a contest of endurance, a struggle to convince their father that they deserved to remain among the living. Some collapsed under the strain, and their collapse was taken as proof that they too had been chosen for sacrifice. Their deaths were not sudden. They were slow, deliberate, and witnessed through the veil of ritual that made cruelty appear sacred. The psychological toll rippled beyond the children. Parents who gave up their sons and daughters learned to mask their grief with piety, repeating Foxley's words until they almost believed them. To question the sacrifice would mean not only suspicion but the chance of losing even more. The community became complicit, trapped in a cycle where mourning was converted into loyalty, and loyalty was rewarded with survival. Every cry silenced by hymns, every smoke trail that rose unseen from the womb, reinforced Foxley's role as both protector and executioner. For Edmund himself, each offering was fuel for his obsession. He no longer thought of himself as merely a father or a lord, but as a priest of fire chosen to refine the world through pain. The screams he muffled with music were not heard as cries of children, but as confirmations of order, proof that his design reached beyond family into society. He believed that his altar of iron was the only reason his household endured while famine claimed others. In his eyes, suffering had become currency, death the most valuable gift one could offer. Yet beneath this mask of order lay the truth that no hymn could drown. The Iron Womb was not a cradle of protection nor a sacred altar. It was a furnace of cruelty, a device that turned the most innocent into fuel for one man's twisted belief. And as the famine slowly receded, as food returned to the fields, the memory of what had been done remained burned into the minds of every child and parent who had survived. For them, hunger had ended, but fear had not. They had seen how easily devotion could be reshaped into sacrifice, how quickly a father's hand could become an executioner's. And for Edmund Foxley, the rituals of fire were not an ending. They were a beginning. With famine fading, he no longer needed hunger as an excuse. The Iron Womb had shown him the power of sacrifice, and now he imagined new ways to shape obedience, new instruments that would not only control bodies and silence tongues, but remake faith itself in his image. At court, the Foxleys appeared as a family touched by grace. Lady Catherine was seen kneeling at chapel altars with hands clasped in perfect devotion. her face serene, her voice soft when reciting prayers. Queen Anne herself once remarked upon her piety, saying the Foxleys seemed to embody the patience and loyalty expected of noble households. Their children were presented in polished garments, quiet and obedient, the very image of discipline admired by courtiers. To all who looked upon them, Foxley Hall seemed a house sanctified, its inhabitants devoted to faith and crown alike. Yet behind the iron gates, Edmund Foxley had fashioned a ritual so grotesque that even the faithful who admired him would have recoiled had they seen what was hidden beneath the fabric of his family's smiles. Within the nursery and halls of Foxley Hall hung rows of masks carved from wood. Each mask was painted with the serene face of a saint or angel, the features frozen into smiles of grace, eyes uplifted as if gazing upon heaven. They looked harmless, almost holy when hung on the wall. But inside, lining the hollow where flesh would meet wood, Edmund had placed nails, small and sharp, pointing inward. When the mask was strapped onto a child's face, the nails pierced the skin of the cheeks, pressed against lips, and dug into the tender flesh around the eyes. The mask forced a smile even as blood welled within. To Edmund, this was the perfect symbol of piety, the outward display of devotion, maintained no matter how much pain burned beneath. The children wore the masks whenever visitors arrived, their mouths frozen into wooden smiles, their voices muffled into broken whispers behind painted lips. To courtiers, their quietness was reverence, their stillness a mark of well-trained faith. None noticed the trails of blood hidden by lace collars or the faint trembling of hands held too tightly against their sides. The nails grew rusted from repeated use and the wood soaked up the blood of countless wearings, but Edmund did not care. He saw in those masks the true essence of holiness, the erasure of the individual, the burial of suffering beneath the guise of worship. The toll was immediate and devastating. The children's faces became disfigured from the constant pressure of the nails. Scars formed where smiles had been forced, infections spread where wounds never healed. Yet even as their flesh rotted, they were paraded before guests as images of angelic obedience. Lady Catherine, herself broken by years of quiet complicity, adjusted the masks with trembling hands, fastening straps tighter when children begged her with their eyes to loosen them. She whispered hymns as she worked, convincing herself that it was devotion, not cruelty, that she was binding to their faces. In truth, she was no longer a mother but a handmaid to Edmund's vision, her own spirit twisted into submission. Death followed as inevitably as infection. One daughter, Elizabeth, developed a fever after wearing the mask for days. The wounds inside her cheeks festered, her lips swelling until she could not breathe. Still, Edmund refused to remove it, declaring that her suffering was sanctification, that the fever was a sign her body was casting out weakness. She died, gasping, her final breaths muffled beneath the painted lips of a saint's frozen smile. Edmund recorded her passing with a chilling calm, writing that her spirit had been perfected through the doctrine of piety. Her mask was polished clean and hung again upon the wall, waiting for the next child to wear it. The surviving children learned a new kind of silence, one more painful than the muzzles that had once bound their tongues. They learned to accept the tearing of their skin without movement, to hold their expressions steady while nails pushed deeper. They became so skilled at hiding pain that their faces betrayed nothing to outsiders, even as their bodies trembled under garments soaked with blood. For them, the mask was no longer a device but an identity. They ceased to recognize their own faces in mirrors, seeing only the painted saints that replaced them. Childhood dissolved into faceless obedience, individuality carved away by iron and wood until only ritual remained. Edmund himself grew more convinced of his holiness. To him, the blood of his children was proof of sacrifice, their forced smiles a sermon louder than any priest could preach. He believed he had achieved what no other nobleman had, a family so perfectly disciplined that even suffering could not mar their devotion. He dreamed of expanding his doctrine beyond Foxley Hall, of one day seeing every household in the kingdom adopt masks of piety for their children, believing that an entire nation could be remade in silent obedience. His ambition grew as their wounds deepened, and he no longer saw himself as father or lord, but as prophet. The servants whispered in secret about the masks, though they dared not speak openly. They claimed the painted faces stared at them even when the masks were hung on the walls, the blood-stained wood seeming to grin in mockery of human flesh. Some swore they heard the children's sobs echoing faintly inside the hollow wood long after the masks had been removed. Yet none dared act, for to defy Edmund Foxley was to risk being sealed away in the bricked chambers beneath the estate, where no voice had ever returned. And so the Foxleys continued to appear at court, polished and smiling, praised for their piety. Their secrets remained hidden beneath velvet collars and polite silence, while Queen Anne herself spoke of Lady Catherine as an example to others. None could imagine that the saintly smiles admired at court were nailed in place, that the devotion praised in whispers of admiration was carved into flesh through ritual torment. To the world, the Foxleys seemed untouchable, paragons of holiness. But within their walls, the masks were only one step toward a greater cruelty. For Edmund Foxley's doctrine of piety was not yet complete. He had shaped bodies, silenced tongues, and forced smiles. Now his obsession turned toward the body itself, believing that even bones could be corrected and remade in the image of his vision. Edmund Foxley had come to believe that sin was written into the body itself. He no longer saw crooked posture or uneven limbs as mere flaws of nature, but as outward signs of inward corruption. To him, slouching was a mark of spiritual decay, a shoulder lower than the other a confession of hidden weakness. His obsession with symmetry consumed him, twisting faith into geometry, morality into measurements. He declared that just as God had made the heavens in perfect order, so too must his children be corrected until their bodies reflected that order. What began as words soon hardened into iron and rope, for Edmund built new instruments to reshape flesh according to his vision. In the bowels of Foxley Hall, he erected the first of his corrective racks. Unlike those used for punishment in dungeons, these devices were built not to punish crime, but to perfect the innocent. Each rack was fitted with ropes and pulleys that stretched the spine, pulling upward on the head and downward on the legs until the body lengthened unnaturally. At first, the children were strapped in for hours, forced to endure the tearing of muscles and the grinding of bones. Edmund stood by with his ledger, marking every inch gained, every cry of pain as though he were measuring a carpenter's beam. He praised the ones who grew taller under strain, declaring them improved, touched by discipline. But those who fainted or whose bones cracked under the tension were labeled failures. When young William's back snapped with a sound that silenced the entire hall, Edmund merely nodded and wrote that the boy's spine had confessed its weakness. William's body was buried in the garden, his death explained away as illness, and the rack was reset for the next child. The racks were only one part of his design. Edmund developed a system of weights sewn directly into clothing, hidden pouches filled with stones or bits of iron that dragged on limbs he believed were uneven. He tied chains to ankles, fastening them to belts of leather stitched into raw skin so the burden could not be removed. Children staggered through the halls with steps slowed by invisible sins, dragging the weight that their father declared was proof of their corruption. To Edmund, this was holy correction. The chains not symbols but physical sermons, reminders that the flesh must be burdened until it learned balance. The children who survived long enough became stiff, rigid, their movements sharp and mechanical. But survival was never guaranteed. The younger ones collapsed under the strain, their flesh torn open where leather dug into skin, their legs swelling until they could no longer stand. Death followed as predictably as breath, each body discarded as though it had only proven the truth of their father's doctrine. The toll on the survivors was both physical and spiritual. Their spines stiffened unnaturally, their shoulders forced into painful alignment. Some grew so tall and rigid that their movements resembled puppets pulled by strings. Others developed grotesque deformities, their bones twisting in ways even Edmund had not intended. But in every case, their spirits fractured. They learned to walk as he demanded, dragging their chains in silence, afraid to stumble for fear that a misstep would mark them as weak. They looked at one another with hollow eyes, knowing that at any moment the weight could claim their lives. Childhood had been replaced by endless correction, their bodies transformed into canvases for their father's obsession. Edmund saw their suffering as triumph. He paraded his surviving children before visiting nobles, their rigid postures admired as signs of discipline, their slow, heavy steps mistaken for grace. He explained that their training prevented them from growing slothful, that the chains purified them of moral imbalance. To those who visited, his words seemed eccentric but admirable. An extreme devotion to raising upright heirs. They never noticed the swollen ankles beneath the stockings, the scars hidden by high collars, or the tremor in the children's hands as they stood motionless for hours. To the outside world, Edmund Foxley was still a man of piety and order. Only those trapped within his walls knew that each smile, each stiffened posture, had been bought with agony. Death became a constant presence in these rituals. Anne, one of the younger daughters, collapsed beneath her chains after days of bleeding where the leather straps cut through flesh. Edmund refused to release her, insisting that her collapse was proof of resistance. He left her lying on the stone floor until her body grew still. When she was carried away, the other children were forced to continue dragging their weights. The silence of the hall broken only by the clink of chains scraping against the floor. Edmund did not mourn her. He wrote that her imbalance had been beyond correction, that her death was not tragedy, but completion. To him, every failure was proof that his doctrine was right. The psychological toll on Edmund himself was masked beneath calm precision. He did not rage. He did not waver. He observed with the detachment of a scientist, the conviction of a priest, recording every detail as if the deaths unfolding around him were data rather than the ruin of his bloodline. In his mind, each broken spine, each torn limb, was a step toward perfecting the human form. He no longer saw his children as children. They were vessels of symmetry, bodies to be sculpted by pain, souls to be bent by obedience. The halls of Foxley Hall grew filled with the sound of chains dragging across stone, a haunting rhythm that echoed through the night. Servants whispered of ghosts, of shadows that moved stiffly through corridors, of children whose eyes no longer seemed human. But they knew these were no phantoms. They were the living remnants of Edmund Foxley's obsession, shaped and scarred by his racks and weights. And still, he was not finished. For even as the bodies piled and the survivors withered, he dreamed of new methods to test their obedience, of rituals that would seal their loyalty in ways more final than iron or wood. The whispers began as fragments carried by trembling servants who could no longer bear the weight of silence. They spoke not in full truths, but in broken hints. Children who never laughed, rooms that smelled of iron and blood, hymns that rose at night with no choir in sight. These whispers reached ears outside the estate, and for the first time in years, suspicion grew strong enough to breach the iron gates of Foxley Hall. An investigation was ordered, not out of certainty, but out of the faint unease that too much perfection often hides a wound beneath. Yet Edmund Foxley had prepared for this moment, not with panic, but with the cold calculation of a man who saw exposure as just another trial to master. The investigators arrived to find a house that breathed lies with every corridor. The halls of Foxley Hall had been altered over years of Edmund's obsession, transformed into a labyrinth of shifting walls and false passages. Doors opened to brick, corridors curved into themselves, staircases led to ceilings instead of rooms. What should have been a home had become a living riddle, a place where truth could never be followed in a straight line. The cages that once rocked with children were left swinging empty, their chains creaking in the stillness as though mocking the search. Hymns drifted faintly through the halls, carried on hidden tubes that Edmund had built into the walls. To the investigators, it seemed the house itself was alive, whispering sanctity even as it buried its secrets deeper. Every step forward revealed nothing but the hollow echo of what once had been. The nursery, when opened, contained only cages polished clean, their spikes shining as though no flesh had ever pressed against them. The chapel glowed with candles, rows of hymnals laid neatly as if awaiting worship. But no children's voices rose, no laughter, no crying. The investigators pressed deeper, their unease growing with every empty room. But Foxley had already sealed away what they sought. In the dead of night, as rumors of inquiry reached him, Edmund had ordered entire wings of the estate bricked shut. Within those walls, the last of his children still lingered, some alive, some already collapsed into silence, entombed with no witness but the stone. For those sealed away, the end came not quickly, but with the slow cruelty of suffocation and starvation. They pressed their hands against walls that no longer gave way to doors, their voices hoarse from screaming in spaces where no ear could hear. Some clawed until their fingers split, others curled against each other in the dark, rocking themselves like pendulums in memory of the cages they once endured. The sounds of their final days never reached the investigators, muffled instead by layers of stone and the careful design of a man who wanted them to vanish without trace. To Edmund, their deaths were not loss, but purification, the final stage of a ritual in which even discovery could be controlled. The investigators wrote reports that spoke of eccentricity but found no proof of crime. They described a house of strange design, of unusual silence, of an unsettling devotion to order. But they left without bodies, without blood, without evidence that the whispers had been anything more than the paranoia of servants. Edmund Foxley greeted them with calm words, offering them food, walking them through his polished halls, smiling as though the house was nothing more than a place of odd architecture. They left uneasy but not alarmed, convinced perhaps that their eyes had been deceived by rumor. Yet the truth remained buried within those sealed wings. The children's bodies, pressed together in darkness, would one day be found decades later. Skeletal remains still leaning against walls that bore the marks of their desperate hands. The investigators never knew they had walked past chambers filled with suffering, past tombs disguised as rooms. Foxley's careful preparations had worked. His house had swallowed the last of its voices, preserving his legacy of silence in stone. Edmund himself stood unshaken. To him, the investigation was not a threat, but a test he had passed. He believed his doctrine had been proven once more, that even when others came searching, his order held. His silence remained unbroken. He walked the empty halls at night, listening to the faint echoes of hymns drifting through his tubes, convinced they were the voices of his children still praising him from beyond the sealed walls. He did not see ruin, he saw triumph. He saw a house purified, a family perfected, a silence so complete that even death could not betray it. And so the investigators left, and Foxley Hall remained standing, a fortress of deception, its walls both prison and tomb. But the silence it carried was not eternal. One day those walls would crack, and what was hidden would be forced into the light. When Foxley Hall finally crumbled, it was not through confession or justice, but through the slow erosion of time. Decades had passed since Edmund Foxley's hand last turned the locks, since the hymns carried through hollow tubes echoed with his design. The house stood abandoned, its iron gates rusting, its gardens overgrown, its halls swallowed by dust and silence. Generations later, when laborers came to tear down the ruins, they expected only stone and rot. What they uncovered instead was a tomb, a monument to cruelty carefully hidden behind the mask of nobility. Beneath collapsed ceilings and bricked passages, they found the cages. Chains still hung from beams blackened by damp, their frames swaying faintly as if stirred by memories of what they once held. Inside were skeletal remains, small and fragile, curled into the positions where death had seized them. Some bore marks of broken bones, others of nails still embedded in jaws, masks of wood rotted away but leaving scars upon skulls. The silence that investigators once mistook for devotion had left its proof in bone. The horror spread quickly, whispered first among the workers and then carried to the towns, then finally into courts and parishes. People demanded to know how such atrocities could have been hidden behind wealth. How a man once praised for his discipline had built chambers of torment beneath a roof that society admired. The ledger was never found, though rumors spoke that Foxley himself had burned it before death, consigning his meticulous records to ash. but the bodies told their own story, a story that no flames could erase. Each skeleton was evidence of method, each iron cage proof of ritual, each sealed wing a testimony to how far silence can stretch when the powerful hide behind faith and order. The discovery could not be dismissed as eccentricity. It forced the kingdom to confront the ease with which cruelty had been disguised as care. In the years that followed, reforms were pressed into law. Child welfare became a word whispered in chambers of power, no longer dismissed as a private matter of the household. Overseers were appointed to noble estates, and inspections were ordered for schools, orphanages, and parishes where children could vanish under the weight of authority. Statutes were passed forbidding confinement of children in corrective devices, and new sermons warned not only of sin but of the dangers of obedience to those who claimed to act in God's name. The ruins of Foxley Hall had become a caution, a wound in the memory of the land that demanded acknowledgement. Yet the shadow of the Foxleys did not vanish with laws. The people who lived near the estate spoke of lingering echoes, chains rattling in empty halls, hymns humming faintly across fields at night, the sound of children's voices, crying softly though no child remained. Whether these were true or the inheritance of memory did not matter, for they reminded all who heard that the past was not buried as easily as brick. Parents warned their children never to wander near the ruins, telling them the soil itself had been poisoned by grief. Memorial stones were later raised in the parish yard, though no names could be carved upon them, for too many had been erased, too many bodies could not be claimed. They were marked instead with a single phrase, "For the lost who slept in iron." The legacy of Edmund Foxley was not one of piety or refinement, but of terror wrapped in the language of care. He had shown how cruelty thrives not in the shadows alone, but in the open, when society admires discipline and mistakes silence for virtue. He had proved that evil does not always wear a mask of ugliness, but can be draped in faith, polished in nobility, praised by the very voices that should have questioned it. The Foxley children were not hidden by accident. They were hidden because no one wished to believe that suffering could be born of such respectable hands. Philosophers who wrote in the years after the discovery reflected grimly on what the cages meant. They said the true horror was not only the pain inflicted on children, but the blindness of those who lived beside it. Neighbors had seen pale faces at windows, had whispered of strange designs, but they accepted the lies of safety, preferring order to truth. Evil does not survive by force alone. It survives in the silence of those who choose not to see. That silence, Edmund Foxley had taught, was as strong a weapon as any cage, and far harder to break. Even now, centuries later, the story of Foxley Hall lingers, not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. It asks how many cruelties today are masked as protection, how many horrors are accepted because they are dressed in the language of faith or law. It forces the listener to ask what obedience costs and what is lost when the powerful are never questioned. The ruins of Foxley Hall may have collapsed, but the questions remain, echoing through history like the faint creak of chains that will not stop swinging. And so the story ends, not with closure, but with the weight of reflection. For if such cruelty could be born in a house praised by queens and priests, admired by neighbors and servants alike, then it can be born again. The cages of iron may rust, but the cages built of silence and trust remain possible in every age. The question is not whether Edmund Foxley was evil. The question is how many saw and chose not to speak. What do you think? Could this happen again?